Hello and welcome. I'm Joy Williamson-Lott, Dean of the University of Washington Graduate School, home of the Office of Public Lectures. I want to thank you for joining us for our graduate school public lecture titled White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide with Dr. Carol Anderson. This conversation will be moderated by UW faculty member Alexis Harris. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the many people and departments who helped make this live stream possible, including the Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity, Department of Communication, Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, Simpson Center for the Humanities, Department of Political Science, Washington Institute for the Study of Inequality and Race, Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies, Department of American Ethnic Studies, the Population Health Initiative, the University Bookstore, and of course our talented live stream production team and graduate school staff. Thank you. I also want to thank you for your continued loyalty as viewers of these great live streams. We know it's not the same experience as what our in-person lectures offered. One day, we will get to see one another in person, and I know our team in the Office of Public Lectures is really looking forward to seeing you too. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Anderson, who is joining us remotely from Atlanta, Georgia, is Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. She's the author of the critically acclaimed White Rage, published by Bloomsbury in 2016. She's also the author of Eyes Off the Prize, the United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, 1944 to 1955, published by Cambridge University Press, which was awarded both the Gustavus Myers and Myrna Bernath Book Awards. Her book, Bourgeois Radicals, The NAACP and the Struggle for Colonial Liberation, 1941 to 1960, was also published by Cambridge in 2014. Dr. Anderson's research has garnered substantial fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Ford Foundation, National Humanities Center, Harvard University, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. She has also served on working groups dealing with race at Stanford's Center for Applied Science and Behavioral Studies, the Aspen Institute, and the United Nations. In addition, and based on the strength and accessibility of her research, the leadership at Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Ford Foundation, and others have used Eyes Off the Prize to frame and examine their human rights work in the United States. Our moderator, Dr. Alexis Harris, is the Presidential Term Professor and Professor of Sociology at the University of Washington. Dr. Harris's work spans the U.S. criminal justice system, including juvenile justice, case processing outcomes, and monetary sanctions. Her research is centered on issues of inequality, poverty, and race. Dr. Harris's book, A Pound of Flesh, Monetary Sanctions as a Punishment for the Poor, details how fines sentenced to defendants often put an undue burden on disadvantaged populations. Once again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, audience, for spending your evening with us. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I'm super excited. We are going to have a great conversation tonight, and I'd like to remind you that you can send questions throughout the discussion to mayiask@uw.edu. Thank you so much, Professor Anderson, for being with us tonight. Your scholarship gives us the foundation for understanding the structural inequalities in the United States and really contextualizing this moment within the broader history, from defining who was a citizen with the full right to vote to ways that white people in this country have suppressed these rights, and then to discussing what you term as white privilege. I'm going to start here with the first question. In your 2014 Washington Post op-ed titled "Ferguson Isn't About Black Rage Against Cops, It's White Rage Against Progress," you wrote, "White rage doesn't have to take to the streets and face rubber bullets to be heard. Instead, white rage carries an aura of respectability and has access to the courts, police, legislatures, and governors who cast its efforts as noble, though they are actually driven by the most ignoble motivations. Can you begin by explaining how you define white rage and how it has operated throughout the United States?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. I love being here, if even in this uh, virtual space. White rage is, we often think of rage as being violent. We think of it as a cross clan burning, a clan cross burning, or we think of it as tiki torches. But when I'm talking about white rage, I'm talking about the policies that come in through legislation, that comes in through executive orders, school board meetings, and zoning board commissions, and judicial decisions. And the design is to undermine African American citizenship rights, to push back the advancements that African Americans have made in terms of accessing their citizenship right. And so we spend so much time, as I have said, as a nation, just focused in on the flames. When we see the fires, when we see the violence, we're like, wow, but we're not paying attention to the kindling, to those policies that in fact made those flames happen.
This framing is so helpful for understanding this moment. This summer, with the horrible killing of George Floyd, many people started talking and reading about the framework of white fragility. Can you explain how the framing of white rage might be more of an appropriate way to understand the history, understand the U.S. history through the white rage lens?
Yeah. And so what I do there, because historian, is I really look at these moments, these key moments where you see there's a narrative in America about, there's several narratives, and one of those deals with if only Black people would. So it's what I call the narrative of Black pathology. That if only Black people would value education, their schools would be good. If only Black people would not be thugs and not do drugs, they wouldn't be locked up. If only Black people would vote. If only Black people would. And so when you have these narratives of Black pathology, it creates a really warped sense of American history. When you're looking at the evidence, however, what you see is that Black people have. And when Black people have and do, the response is not to embrace that as being part of the American dream, but to in fact view it as a threat that has to be pushed back, and pushed back in ways that the policies make that seem like a legitimate effort. And one of those things that the policies also do, and we have to be clear about this, is it helps legitimize then the violence against Black people.
Your framing is really helpful because the white fragility framework sort of treats white people as the victim in this, and that we have to be sensitive. They're fragile. But the rage, when you frame it as white rage, it highlights our pain and suffering and the violence and trauma that's done by these laws. In terms of the consequences of this white rage, you write, the truth is white rage has undermined democracy, warped the Constitution, weakened the nation's ability to compete economically, squandered billions of dollars on baseless incarceration, rendered an entire region sick, poor, and woefully undereducated, and left cities nothing less than decimated. All this havoc has been wreaked simply because African Americans wanted to work, get an education, live in decent communities, and raise their families and vote, because they are unwilling to take no for an answer. You can tell I really love your writing. But what have been the consequences of the outcomes of white rage for people in this country?
Ooh. So let's take education. Because that chapter I wrote in White Rage on the Brown decision, for instance, that one almost broke me. Because here you see children who are willing to take on a system that is going to eviscerate them, but are willing to do so because they envision what could be on the other side. Quality education for everybody. Wow. And instead, what we get is this massive uprising from politicians who signed the Southern Manifesto saying, so when you have over 100 members of Congress signing a manifesto saying they will defy the US Supreme Court, when you have governors and state legislators and school board members figuring out how to shut down entire public school systems and then funnel tax dollars into white children so that they can go to all white private academies while there is nothing available for Black kids. When you think about how, as years go by, and these children are left with virtually nothing, as the US economy is changing from a manufacturing-based economy to a knowledge-based, technology-based economy. So what we are doing is we are setting up swaths of our population to not be able to engage in that next wave of economic advancement in this nation. And one of the stories that I tell in White Rage, to give a sense of the power of it, was Sputnik in 1957. So here you have the Soviets. They launched this satellite, and it sends tremors through the national security defense mechanism, because it's like, wow, if they can get that thing up in space, that means that they have the ability to get their nuclear weapons across the ocean to hit us. So the US is now looking at the possibility of nuclear annihilation. Eisenhower comes in, and President Eisenhower is like, oh, we have got to prepare to have the brain power to fight the Cold War. So the federal government is getting ready to do something unheard of, and that is to put hundreds of millions of dollars into education so that we can build the kinds of labs and buildings and have the fellowships and scholarships that students need in order to be scientists and engineers and mathematicians. I mean, think about this. But this is 1957. 3 years after Brown, 2 years after Brown 2, the implementation decision, with all deliberate speed. And the congressmen and the senators who were working that piece of legislation through Congress, they said, they were from Alabama. And they said, whoa, let me see if I get this right. You want to put funding into colleges and universities? Eisenhower, yes. We would love federal funding, but we want to keep our all-white admissions policies. Can we have the federal funding with an all-white admissions policies that is absolutely in defiance of Brown? And so you think about this, you're looking at nuclear annihilation and you're worried about Jim Crow? And the federal government said, yes, hundreds of millions of federal dollars can pour in and you can keep your all-white admissions policies. Think about what that means for this nation.
Right.
Yeah. That's
and
white rage.
you highlight this, a lot of the policies that you talk about sort of explain what white rage does to the Black community, but what does white rage do to the white community?
And so you can see the kind of impact that this begins to have.
Right.
Because you're seeing that schools now aren't getting the kinds of funding that they need. You're seeing that we have populations. So it's not just African Americans, but you see how it eddies out and it affects other communities. It affects white communities. The same thing happens with the vote. I mean, as you keep looking at these policies, one of the policies, for instance, that I look at is the war on drugs. Because this to me really just, So in the war on drugs, what we see when we're looking at the data is that we have locked up most those who do and sell drugs the least. That's a real interesting war. And it's cost the US about $1 trillion for this war on drugs. It has destabilized state budgets as funding has gone to prisons and not to education. It has wreaked havoc on communities as we extract human beings, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters. But when you think about what that trillion could have done, instead of locking up most those who do drugs the least, we could have had treatment programs. We could have had funding for access to quality, affordable care for all. We could have had schools adequately financed. We could have had a real infrastructure program. We could have had. We could have been able to pay and have affordable tuition at our public universities and colleges so that students weren't saddled with mountains of debt. The choices that we make for white rage affect the quality of life for all of us in this nation.
In the beginning of your book, it's powerful. Well, the whole book is powerful. I enjoyed it. But you juxtapose sort of the media portraying Black rage in response to the killing of Amadou Diallo in 1999 and then Mike Brown in 2014. And then we could say most recently, we've seen this Black rage, with the state-sponsored killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, taking to the streets, the uprisings, the protests. It's visibly expressed our pain and our anger. Is there another way that you think we should be expressing our rage, a more useful way?
Oh, I love that. I think that one of the things that we've seen, and I mean, the report just came out a couple of days ago, is that these protests were defined as being violent. And that played into another one of the tropes of the narratives of Black pathology. Black people are violent, and this is how their rage works. Well, the reports have shown that 90% of the Black Lives Matter protests were actually nonviolent. And that when they were identifying the violence, it was coming from police instigated violence, or it was coming from one of those right-wing boogaloo boys types who were shooting up police stations or killing cops, or so that the narrative, so even asking, how do we protest, means that we're asking a question like we had to do during the civil rights movement. To understand that nonviolence was in fact a deliberate strategy to destabilize the narrative of Black violence, to destabilize the narrative of white innocence, so that what the media was portraying as they saw students sitting at a lunch counter in their Sunday best, being beaten up by whites who are, T-shirts, the cigarettes, and the and the media's looking at this going, what? And that is that destabilizing narrative. And this is where we are. Right. This is the kind of protest that makes America stop and think.
Right, it's powerful.
Who are we? What are we doing? How did this happen? Because this isn't lining up with everything that I thought I knew. I mean, that is frankly what the video of 8 minutes and 46 seconds did. It caused a moment a long moment of self-reflection.
Right. And so we can talk about the moment that we're in right now. You are a historian of the right to vote and voter suppression, and you mentioned the criminal justice system. I study the criminal legal system, and the fines and fees are monetary sanctions associated with convictions. I often say our U.S. criminal system is exceptional worldwide, and it's exceptional in the way that in the numbers of people that we have living behind bars, but also in the disproportionate way in which we confine Black and brown bodies in this country. Just under 7 million people are under some form of supervision or living behind bars. We have an estimated 5.7 million people now who are politically disenfranchised and can't vote on next Tuesday. In Washington State, just for context for folks here, there are about 45,000 people who can't vote. What do you think about Florida's Amendment 4 and the struggle to give people with felony convictions the right to vote and those who owe monetary sanctions and can't vote?
To understand why we had to have Amendment 4 in the first place, I'm going to do that historian thing and take us back.
Thank you.
In 1867, I'm going back. In 1867, the radical Republicans in Congress passed the Reconstruction Act. So this is right after the Civil War. What the Reconstruction Act did, in addition to some other pieces, it provided for the right to vote for Black men. In 1868, Florida passed its felony disfranchisement law. So Black men get the right to vote in 1867. In 1868, Florida passes its felony disfranchisement law and crafts a series of laws, Black codes, that were only enforced against African Americans or only applied to African Americans. So it was a way to use the criminal justice system to incarcerate Black people and strip them of their voting rights. That law from 1868 basically is what was in operation. They looked at it again like in 1968 and said, no, we're keeping this. And what that meant was by 2018, there were over 6 million people who could not vote in the United States because of a felony conviction. 1.7 million of them were in Florida alone. And through a massive ballot initiative, Amendment 4, 65% of the Floridians who voted said, people have paid to society. There is no need to have this civic death where they are blocked from access for representation. Those are the basic foundational principles of democracy. They have paid their debt. 65%. The Republican legislature and Governor DeSantis looked up and basically did a Fred Sanford, heart clutch, Elizabeth, I'm coming. And said, how do we stop this? Because they were looking up and it meant that about 1.4 million Floridians were going to get their voting rights. And in Florida, 40% of Black men had been disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. And over 20% of Black adults could vote in Florida because of a felony conviction. With Amendment 4, that was changing. So what the legislature did was to say, you have to pay all fees, fines, and restitution before you can vote. Well, that looks like a poll tax, which is unconstitutional because we don't ask folks who haven't paid their property tax. You know, if you haven't paid your property tax, you can still vote. That thing went up through the courts. The ruling by the 11th Circuit was Kafka meets Alice in Wonderland. So what it said was that it was not a poll tax, and so they were going to have to pay, and the state of Florida did not have to tell them how much they owed.
It's outrageous.
So you begin to think about this. So I look at it as this is the worst of the poll tax. You've got to pay what you cannot afford because that's how they set it up. And like the literacy test, which is also now banned, that the state can ask you an absolutely unanswerable question. How many bubbles in a bar of soap? How high is up?
Mm.
And if you can't answer the unanswerable, you can't vote. That's what is happening in Florida right now. So after that ruling by the 11th Circuit, Florida officials are now going through the voter registration rolls, removing returning citizens who had registered to vote but had not paid from the rolls in this election. It is blasphemous against democracy.
And it's important to note that that's not just Florida. There are many other states, I review this in my book, that have the same sort of ambiguous or vague description in statute that until you've completed all of your sentence alternatives or sentencing, you can't have the right to vote. In Washington, we had a similar decision to 2008. In 2009, the legislature has given the provisional right to vote, but people still on supervision can't vote. And so there's this, it's unclear and a lot of miseducation. Do you think that people who are out of confinement should have the right to vote, or even people who are in jail and prison should have the right to vote?
Well, I definitely think that those who are out, I mean, and part of what we know is that it is the re-engagement in society.
Yeah.
And how absolutely essential voting is for that re-engagement. And to continue what I call civic death is just unconscionable.
What have been other sort of major moments in U.S. history that have been like these major moments of voter suppression?
So voter suppression has been actually the leitmotif, and you get these little moments where the voting rights expand, but there's consistent pushback on that. So we even, like right now, this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that provided for women's right to vote. But Black women, really, if you were in the South, you did not have the right to vote. And so what Black women had to deal with, even with the 19th Amendment. So this is why we get when Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi, who is a sharecropper, tries to register to vote, she is beaten, and thrown off. She's thrown off the land, so she has no way of making money, no way of sustaining a livelihood. And when she gets ill and goes to the hospital, they forcibly sterilize her. So you have these policies in place about who is virtuous enough to vote. The power of the Voting Rights Act really helped transform this democracy. And still, it was an ongoing battle. You had Supreme Court cases coming in almost immediately from the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. You had South Carolina challenging it in 1966. You had Mississippi and Virginia in 1969. And the court cases kept coming until we get to 2013. And I look at that as part and parcel of the backlash for the election of Barack Obama. Because again, remember, part of the foundational principle of white rage, that it isn't the presence of Black people that becomes the trigger. It's Black people who achieve, who aspire. And to have this Black man become president of the United States, That was like the ultimate affront.
That he had that audacity, right?
He had the audacity, right? And so part of what we heard with his election, both of them, was, well, how racist can America be? Because we put a Black man in the White House twice. And so what that was saying was, how racist can white voters be because the majority of us voted for him twice? Well, that's not accurate, because the majority of white voters have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964, since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it wasn't that was the trigger. So you ask, how did Obama get elected? He had a sizable number of whites, but he had an incredible ground game. Grassroots organizing, mobilizing, voter registration, get to the polls, brought millions of new voters to the polls. They were overwhelmingly African American, Hispanic, Asian American, young, and poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. That would become the hit list after the Shelby County v. Holder decision in 2013 that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And then you see these voter suppression laws spread across the United States, targeting at least one of those groups, sometimes multiple groups with a series of policies.
So we can talk now about the current election. And you write in the afterword to White Rage that in 2016, Trump was viewed as America's last chance. MAGA was, quote, weighted with heavy racial baggage. Can this rhetoric and rage win again this time? What are your predictions?
Okay, so you're asking a historian to predict, but okay, I will. I think that this election is as important as the election in 1860. On one hand, we have someone who despises democracy and has made that contempt obvious with the shredding of so many of the norms, with the debasement of so many of the institutions, with the vilification of the press, the vilification of opponents, of those who don't agree with, and so what I think is that despite all of this voter suppression, I mean, we've seen the lines. We had 11-hour lines here in Georgia in early voting, 11 hours. There were 5-hour lines, 6-hour lines. We're seeing those same kinds of lines all across this nation. People are determined to fight for this democracy. They understand that it is a turning point in this nation's history. And that if we don't vote in this election, we may not have another one for a long time.
That's heavy. and it's so real. And based on our history, it is so real. I'll ask one more question before we go to the question and answer. A week from today, Wednesday, November 4th, the day after the election, what should we focus on?
Some tea.
Some yoga and meditation.
Because part of what we have to realize is that what Trump is doing is he is trying to have the election called on the 3rd, knowing that tens of millions of mail-in ballots have been used in the midst of this pandemic that he deliberately failed to control. So people went to the mail-in ballots so that they could honor their right to vote as well as to honor their safety. Well, many states have a law that they cannot even begin to process those ballots until Election Day. So that it's going to take some time to count those up. It also means that as we've had this court making these crazy rulings, and as we have had Trump kneecapping the postal service, so as he has said, because I don't want them to be able to process all those mail-in ballots, so that you're going to have a bit of a lag time in terms of, so there will be some ballots that are postmarked on election day, but don't actually get in for several days after that. So it's going to take some time, and we just need to be patient and not listen to the call, well, I won, unless we have the ballots counted. And so on November 4th, we're still waiting for the ballots to be counted. Unless there is some earnest angel miracle out there that the big elect college states have enough of their ballots counted. And I mean really counted. That we know. And we really don't know, because an election in the midst of a pandemic where you have a president who is threatening violence. And so we have to vote, if you haven't already, have a plan to vote.
Right.
That includes comfortable shoes, your cell phone, a battery pack, some water, and be ready.
Right.
And if stuff gets crazy, call 1-866-OUR-VOTE, which is the lawyers hotline of like the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, who has been doing amazing work in litigating and trying to open up this democracy.
Thank you. Well, we're going to move to some questions and answers from our questions from our viewers. I want to remind our viewers that you can go to mayiask@uw.edu to submit your questions. The first question, your book talks about how pervasive white rage is in the United States. Do you think that there's a way to diffuse it or dismantle it moving forward?
I do. I do. And that might be what, but I really do, because one of the reasons I wrote the book and why it's so heavily footnoted is because if we can begin to have a real conversation based on evidence, not based on rhetoric, as we begin to understand as a nation the toll that white rage has had on our ability to educate our children, to make a living wage, to live in affordable housing and safe neighborhoods, in wonderful communities. As we begin to think about how it has stunted our access to quality health care, as we begin to think about the toll that white rage has had on us, and we're talking from a space of evidence, then that means then that we can come together, because one of the key ways that white rage works is by what I call the zero-sum game. That the only way that blacks can get will be at whites' expense. And that's not accurate. That's not true. So once we begin to dismantle those narratives of black pathology and the zero-sum game, then we're at a very different space to diffuse the power of white rage.
Someone asks, how can Black communities and other marginalized communities keep hope? How do you keep passion and pushing forward?
Oh, that is part of the beauty of being a historian, because you begin to think through how horrible. I mean, when you look at slavery and how they learned to keep their culture, their vision, their hope, how they knew that freedom was theirs, how they refused to accept that they were less than human, even though everything around them was telling them that. When you see how they fought for their freedom, wow. Those are some powerful shoulders we are standing on. And that's, I see my work as helping us to understand what that vision, what that resilience, what that hope looked like. Because that hope, and so we do the work of hope. That's what this is about.
That's powerful. Another viewer asked, why is Black rage considered more visible than white rage?
I think that is the part of the power of a long narrative. So again, when you go back to slavery, how do you justify ripping millions of people from their homeland? How do you justify branding them, raping them, breeding them, murdering them, working them without compensation? And so you create an entire architecture that talks about their villainy, how dangerous they are. And in that process of discussing that and setting that foundation in religion, in science, and in culture, it's also then crafting a narrative of whites as civilized. And so when Black folks erupt, it's like, see, told you. It plays into that narrative. And it's been happening for so long that the idea of Black as threat becomes part of the foundational ways that this society operates. So think about it this way. Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by police when he was trying to get into his car, and his babies are in the back seat. Kyle Rittenhouse shoots 3 people, kills 2 of them, is walking by police with the rifle. And they're like, yeah, hey, they didn't see threat when they saw a white man with a rifle. But a Black man getting into his car, they saw threat and shot him 7 times in the back. There are these multiple instances. I take Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, what? Jeffrey Dahmer, serial killer, cannibal. A young man, he was a teenager, 14, Asian young boy. He escaped from Dahmer's apartment, butt naked, drugged, bleeding. Black women saw this child running and called the police going, there's a boy who's hurt. Dahmer runs out of the apartment. Dahmer says, oh, he's 18 and it's just a lover's quarrel. The police look at Dahmer. They look at these Black women going, there's something wrong here. They look at this Asian boy, 14, and just like, but they see Dahmer, white, blonde hair, who says, oh, it's a lover's quarrel, and they escort the boy back up to Dahmer's apartment. No sense of threat happened there. And so when we do see white violence, it's often then seen as aberrational. When there is Black violence, it is seen as typical. What do you expect? That's who they are. we're dealing with we got to dismantle a lot of the work
Right.
that has been done to create these racialized hierarchies um,
Right.
that do damage.
And it's so infused, as you say, in our culture, in our media, these stereotypes and these biases. How do we chip away? Have you seen us being able to chip away at these negative tropes and the rhetoric?
I see us working on it. I see us working. We got a lot of work to do.
Amen.
But the first piece is to even know that, right? That there's something awry here. It's like the work of Jennifer Eberhardt, who is a psychologist up at Stanford, who is dealing with implicit biases and that work. It is the work of Rayshawn Ray at the University of Maryland, who is doing that work. I mean, so this is happening. Because the first piece is that awareness that, okay, so why is Dylan Roof, who killed 9 people in a church at Bible study, taken to Burger King? Because the police recognized his humanity. And why then is George Floyd strangled to death when he wasn't resisting arrest? Yeah.
And it's so clear, right? The contrast. It is so clear, and there's so much empirical evidence. And it seems like folks are saying this over and over again, yet it still happens. What brought you to study these issues?
When I'm an Army brat, and when my father was career military, and when he got out of the service, we moved to Columbus, Ohio, because he wanted my brother to go to Ohio State. And my mother found a house that she just loved. And the realtor was like, that's not where you people live. And I'm a little kid, but I'm, trying to process you people. Because I'm thinking, who would you people be? People who fought in the war? Who would you people be? People who were away from home for years, defending this country? Is that who the you people would be? And then seeing where we ended up buying a home, watching my neighborhood turn into the hood, and seeing how the people who lived there weren't the people that they talked about on the news. These were the folks on my block, in my neighborhood, who were these honest, hardworking, God-fearing folk who had the Trinity on their mantles when you walked in the house. Some combination of Jesus, Martin Luther King, and JFK. There was some kind, these were the folk. And so I saw that they were doing everything that they were supposed to do. And they were getting devoured. And so I went on the hunt to find out what those structures were that could take down God-fearing, hard-working, honest folk. And that's how I got started on this. So the first book was called Eyes Off the Prize. African Americans and the United Nations and African Americans. I should know the title of my own book. United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights. And that's how I got started. I'm really interested in what I call fractured citizenship. Citizenship that looks like it's there, but it is so broken that it can easily be dismantled by just policies, just by pushing on one piece of it, and it just collapses.
That sort of brings us back, because we have a couple more questions about voting. One question is, in what ways are the partisan conflicts on mail-in voting during the COVID-19 pandemic related to the broader issue of voter suppression?
It's all the way live. Remember, I'm from Ohio, so you know you're going to get a little lakeside. the So what we see, and this is what's so important to understand, is that it's not voting that's the issue. It's who's voting that becomes the issue. So as long as mail-in ballots were basically primarily used and overused by Republicans, you didn't hear the language of massive rampant fraud. But the moment in the midst of this pandemic, all of a sudden, when it becomes really clear that this is an option for Democratic constituencies, then you hear the language of fraud coming from the White House, coming from Bill Barr, and know that this is a pattern. One of the things that I lay out in One Person, No Vote is that in Alabama, in the late 1970s, there was two women. There were two women, Julia Wilder and Maggie Bozeman. One was the head of the SCLC, the other of the NAACP. And they were trying to figure out how, nearly 15 years after the Voting Rights Act, Black folks in this nearly majority Black county still weren't having any kind of representation. They figured out it was the absentee ballots that were being used by whites. And so they figured out how to use absentee ballots, got African Americans using absentee ballots, and boom, they got charged with voter fraud. Convicted and thrown in prison. The next couple of years, Jeff Sessions went after the Marion Three, who were using absentee ballots to begin to have Black representation, because almost 50% or so of Black folks were out of the county at the time, working. So, and the polls were only open 4 hours a day. So absentee ballots worked. And they got hauled into court and charged with voter fraud. So it's not the method of voting, it's who is voting becomes why you hear the language and the lie. Let me be really clear, the lie of voter fraud.
Another question along that lines is, how can we fight against voter suppression tactics?
One is to know what they are. So like when we see these long lines and you have folks going, wow, look at all of that voter enthusiasm. No, no, that's not voter enthusiasm. What you're seeing is that government officials have not put the level of resources into those communities so that you would not have 11-hour lines. And this is deliberate. Even in the June primary here in Georgia, and this was a primary that got pushed back because of the pandemic, they did a study and they found that in white voting precincts, where 90% of the eligible voters were white, their average wait was 6 minutes. In minority precincts, where 90% or more were minorities, their average wait was 51 minutes. Now you begin to think about how you calculate what to do with your time. If you know that you can pop in and out in 6 minutes, or whether it's going to take you about an hour. It's a poll tax. And what that's designed to do is to make you think about how much time it's going to take in your day when you have to punch a clock and get back to work to be able to vote. Yeah, it's knowing what these policies are, how they cover themselves in the issue of legality of voter fraud. And then what you do is you vote in representatives who believe in democracy and who do not believe in voter suppression. it makes a world of difference. We saw that in Virginia. What Virginia looked like at the beginning of this decade and what Virginia looks like at the end of this decade is the difference between having those who believe in democracy at the helm and those who don't.
It's powerful. I'll go with this question. Is it idealistic for believing that the United States will ever honor every citizen equally?
It is not idealistic. And I know that sounds, for somebody who's a historian, I look into the abyss. But when you think about movements have always been fought on the aspirational plane of who America says it is. It has not been fought on the reality. It has been fought on, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And so those battles have been, didn't make it self-evident. And again, when you think about, at its founding, about 6% of Americans were eligible to vote. We have fought some battles. We're going to continue to fight. One of the things that oppression and voter suppression are designed to do is to make you think it's hopeless. Voter suppression is designed to create voter depression. That there's nothing we can do, the system's rigged. They wouldn't be after your vote so much if it wasn't so powerful, if it wasn't so transformative. And so it is your vote, and then it is holding them accountable. So no, it is not hopeless. It is we have to continue to stay engaged.
That is the perfect sentiment to end on. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. I, didn't calculate the extra hours, but it's my bedtime where you're at right now. So thank you for staying up late and just sharing your ideas and your research with us. We really, really appreciate it. I want to give a big thank you to our audience for sharing your evening with us as well and engaging with us. I'd also like to thank Yvette Moy and Molly Mandeltor and everyone here at the UW and the UW Bookstore for making this event run so smoothly. I hope our conversation has empowered you, has educated you, and motivated you to keep reading and to keep talking and engaging and working towards real change. I pray you are all safe and healthy and happy and take care of yourselves, especially next week. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.